All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good morning. If you do not have, there's two handouts at either door. One is just kind of the handout that I made, and the other is a little article on the subject of cremation, which we'll walk through. But we have plenty of both, so even if you came with a spouse or a friend, you don't have to share if you don't want to. And then there's also pens as well if you want to take a few notes. All right. Welcome everyone, and thanks for coming. I know it's not the easiest of subjects or the best of subjects. You didn't wake up today saying, "Today's the day I planned my funeral," and you may not get very far today, but it's a conversation that we have to have. We're gonna have it at some point. The question is, do you want to be involved in it or not? And so this is to be very proactive. So I just applaud you for coming and trying to get out in front of it a little bit. Maybe you're kind of well along the way. You've planned a lot of your funeral. You've written it down. You've told your next of kin. But I also know just from experience, 14 years as a priest, a lot of people, even people older, even people who are ill, kind of don't want to talk about it. Now, we all get that. It's not a subject we want to talk about necessarily, but it's important. So we're offering this this morning, and then there'll be another, this exact same class again tonight at 7. You're welcome to come back if you don't get what you need this morning. And then we're also recording it right here on my little phone. And so if there's people who were not able to come today, maybe relatives somewhere else, their priest is lazy and doesn't want to do these. I'm just kidding. Anyway, if it can be shared beyond our parish, that would certainly be a good thing. Okay, let's take a moment and pray before we begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God our Father, as we come to you today, we thank you for the great gift of life. We know that life is not always as long as we wish it to be. We know that you are the giver of life. And so we come to you as we look to plan events of the future, to plan our funeral, to think about our own death. We ask that in the days that we have remaining, whether they are long or whether they are short, that the glory would be yours, that we would live each and every day to the fullest, drawing many to you and to your church. Be with us in this time together. Give us wisdom and knowledge, and help us always to follow your will. And we ask this through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So there's kind of three inspirations for this gathering. Number one is the influence I received when I was in the seminary. I went to a seminary called St. Meinrad Seminary, and it's a Benedictine monastery in southern Indiana. And one of the things that Benedictine monks do, we have them here. We have Benedictine monks and sisters here in Oklahoma, St. Gregory's Abbey, Clear Creek Abbey out east, the St. Joseph Monastery in Tulsa. One of the things that Benedictines do, monks and sisters, is they are encouraged by St. Benedict from the 5th century to think about their death every day. Now you might say, that sounds terrible. I don't want to do that. But the idea is that if every day you spend just a little bit of time considering that for every one of us, our time on this earth is going to end at some point. It just is, right? Benjamin Franklin, death and taxes are the two certainties of life, right? It's going to happen. It's going to happen. And so to consider your death every day, in order so that the life you've been given, the days you've been given, would be lived to the full. That we don't take for granted the life that we've been given. So that's one inspiration. Another inspiration is my own father. My dad, Marty O'Brien, he's 80 years old. in pretty good shape. Has slowed down a little bit, of course, as the years have gone on. There was an example, it was probably about 5 years ago. My dad and I, we like to watch sports together. So we were traveling to the NCAA Final Four, and I forget the city, but we were there, and he was always very independent. I remember we pulled up at the hotel and opened up the trunk of the car, and he said, "Hey, would you mind getting my bag out of the trunk?" And I thought, he's never asked me to do that, ever. I think my dad is slowing down a little bit. And so I got the bag out of the trunk. But my dad has always really taken his role as a husband and a father very seriously, in the sense of providing for his family. My mom was able to stay home with us, and my dad went to work every day. And one of the things that my dad takes very seriously is my wife and my kids, are they going to be provided for when I'm gone, whenever that may come? And so my dad, and I don't mean this isn't meant to be funny, but it is kind of funny. My dad has a book. He has this desk, and he's very organized, and he's got his taxes, and he's got any trips coming up. Everything's got a notebook. Well, he has a notebook, and the notebook is called "I'm Dead." Now, when I went home this a couple years ago, and he said, "Here, I need to show you something. This is the I'm Dead book." And I'm like, okay, this is the weirdest conversation I think I've ever had. And he walks me through it. And what it has is kind of step-by-step instructions of what's to happen when he dies, whenever that may come. In there, he has the whole funeral planned out, music, readings. The plan is, for me, I'm going to do the funeral as a priest. But he has in there the cemetery plot, where both he and my mom will be buried. He has already written his own obituary. Now, do you want to do that? I don't know. But he has. And the only thing blank are the dates. Everything else is in there. Now, you want to talk about securing your own legacy, right? He wrote his own obituary. But anyway, but there it all is. And here's the safety deposit box. Here's, the copy of the will. All of those things. And his goal was to kind of be funny and to make a little bit light of it. But ultimately, to make things easy on my mom, if she's still here, and then on the 5 kids and on the grandkids. So even though it's kind of, he tries to be funny about it, but ultimately, it's for me, it was a good example of just being prepared as much as possible. The other one is that as a priest, I was ordained when I was 31 years old, and 60 days after ordination, we are required as priests to turn in our funeral plans, our medical, sort of end-of-life medical paperwork, and our will. So I'm 31 years old and thinking, what readings do I want at my funeral? Anyway, and it's all done. It took me about an hour or so. I sat with an attorney for about an hour. Now, I don't have a lot of stuff, that makes it a little easier when it comes to passing on what I own to somebody else. But sat down, it probably took all in about 2 hours. It's in a file, it's at the diocese. When I die, somebody pulls out the file, they open it up, and there's my plans. Okay? So I offer those as maybe a little motivation. On the negative motivation side, I'll just tell you what I've seen in 14 years as a priest. And what I've seen is a lot of families get caught off guard by death. And it's not surprising, because oftentimes death comes quickly. We don't always know when it will come. The scriptures tell us, you know not the day nor the hour. And so a lot of families get caught off guard. And so now suddenly there's been a death. It may be very sudden, maybe not. But now the family is kind of scrambling. And they're trying to kind of throw together plans. And what I hope that today will do is to try to get out in front of some of those decisions that your children or grandchildren or your spouse or somebody will have to make. But you can make them now when you're of good mind, when you have a little time to pray about it and to think about it, rather than something sort of rushed to plan a funeral in the course of just a couple days. So let me start with, on this handout, I just listed a few misconceptions that I hear as a priest, and I'll just draw your attention to a few of these. I think a lot of people think, and it's sort of a superstitious thing, that I don't want to plan my funeral because if I do, like somehow my death is going to come sooner. And I get that idea, but of course we know that that's not true. To plan one's funeral is to be prepared. But so if that's maybe something kind of working in you, like if I plan it, then it's going to happen, and I don't want it to happen. But hopefully you can put that aside. One other misconception that we hear is that in a lot of people's minds, they think their family thinks like they do. And so this has especially played out kind of dramatically. We had this is maybe about a year ago now. Somebody died, and the kids were not as practicing in their faith as the parents. And so for the kids, having a funeral mass was simply not a priority. And so there was not a funeral mass. There was nothing in writing. The deceased had not put down anything, had not sort of made those wishes known to their children. And I think they were just of the mind, well, of course my kids will. And they didn't. And so one of the things we do as a parish, just kind of underneath, is we always have a mass. If somebody has died and there's not a funeral mass, we always have a mass celebrated for them at some point in the near future. It's really our duty to the deceased. But do not assume that you, your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, whoever is going to plan your funeral, do not just assume that they believe the same things as you do. And so you've got to write it down. You got to make it known, and you got to write it down. So hopefully today will help. Another misconception is that the Catholic funeral should be a celebration of your life. Now that sounds harsh, but ideally, it's not that sort of idea has kind of snuck into funerals a lot. You'll see that written even in obituaries, that this is come to St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church for a celebration of life Tuesday at 10. Can your life be celebrated? Yes. Should it be? Yes. But ultimately, the goal of a Catholic funeral, whether the rosary the night before or the funeral mass, is to pray for your soul, is to pray for the one who has died, and also for the consolation of their family. So ultimately, the funeral, all that goes into the funeral in the Catholic Church, is more than just, wow, he was such a good guy. Wow, she was so nice to people and charitable. All of that will come out, of course, but we're there to pray. We're there to pray for the soul of the one who has died and to pray for the consolation of their family. All right, so that's another misconception. The fourth one is that your funeral is all about you and what you want. Again, that sounds a little bit harsh, but what I mean by that is that it's not necessarily going to be exactly as maybe you envisioned it. So a lot of times, just one example is to schedule it. So many times, somebody dies, the family comes and says, we will be having the funeral Friday at 10 o'clock. And we come back as the church and say, well, you can't. There's already a funeral scheduled Friday at 10 o'clock, or there's a wedding, or there's something else. And many times the family is kind of upset that their immediate kind of this is what we want and what we need is not met. So there has to be this back and forth. So one of the things I just encourage is when a death occurs, obviously you have to call family, you have to call a funeral home, and then immediately call us, call the parish, and let's get that process of planning underway. What happens very often is lots of plans are made, and then the parish is sort of brought in later. The priest might be gone. The church might already be booked. There might be another funeral. So that's important, is to get the parish involved very early on. The last misconception, and we're going to talk a lot about this, is that the Catholic Church is opposed to cremation. Now, we'll talk through exactly what we mean by this, but we're not. you can be cremated. All right, the article that I've given you, and we'll walk through this a little bit later, but it's just a wonderful little reflection from one of our priests, Father John Grant, on what we mean by cremation and kind of whether, kind of how it plays out in the course of a funeral. So we'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about planning your funeral. I've left you some space on the little handout here so you can take a few notes as we go along. And then if there's questions related specifically to this little section, feel free to raise your hand and we'll kind of take those as we come. So the first thing that you can do, and you can do this right now, is to choose a funeral home. You can do that now. You can do that whenever you'd like. Here in Stillwater, we have two funeral homes. We have Strode, that's very popular, kind of right off of 6th Street, kind of right by the courthouse there. And then also Dighton Marlar, which is out on, Washington, kind of as you go out of town towards the Turnpike. Both of them know us well. Both of them work with us very closely. We have each other on speed dial. We know each other pretty well. So picking a funeral home that you're comfortable with. Because what happens, if you've not seen this or not familiar with it, when somebody dies, the first call, the hospital staff or the hospice staff, or they're going to ask you, what funeral home would you like to use? And many, many times I've seen families kind of in shock at the death of their loved one, and they don't know. They say, well, just call somebody. So this is the time now to start thinking through, who do you want? You can go meet with them. They have brochures, they have websites, they have all kinds of information so that you can pick whichever one that you prefer. But both of them here in town work well with us. Sometimes it's a funeral home from out of town. That complicates things a little bit. I think it's more expensive because they have to travel and all kinds of, but anyway, there's lots of different options. One thing I would say on the funeral home is that the funeral home works for you. Now, again, our funeral homes are wonderful. They're filled with wonderful people, but ultimately it's a business. And they're very good. I don't see either of our funeral homes kind of taking advantage of people, but I've heard those stories elsewhere. But ultimately, they work for you. And so you tell them what you want, and then it will be their job to make that happen. One thing you can do even now, you can go and tour and visit. I know a lot of people, my dad in the I'm Dead book, their caskets are already paid for. All of that stuff has been chosen through the funeral home where my parents live down in Houston. So choose a funeral home. You can do that even now. All right, then we talk about whether to have a casket at your funeral or to be cremated. Both of them are allowed, but the church would also say that they're not necessarily equal. I think the church in her liturgy has in mind a casket. So again, it's not required, but the church has in mind a casket. So if you look, I have this wonderful book called The Order of Christian Funerals, and I've had this my whole life as a priest, and I use it at every funeral. And what it does is it has all the, kind of what the priest is supposed to do and supposed to say, and then kind of the little writing down at the bottom, it says, if the person is cremated, then do this and say this. But ideally, it calls for a coffin. One option that a lot of people don't know about is you can actually have a coffin at the funeral and then be cremated later. You can actually, this sounds weird, and you can rent a casket. You can. It's one of those things that I think funeral homes have said, well, there's a demand for it, let's do it. So have a casket at the funeral and then to be cremated later. So that's up to you. What I would encourage is to read this full article here from Father Grant. But I want to just point out, if you go to page 3, of the article, and go down to the 3rd paragraph, and it starts with, for those who do choose cremation. Does everyone see that? For those who do choose cremation. I'm just going to read this whole paragraph because I think it's very important. And this is something to write down, something to tell your kids and grandkids, your next of kin. So Father Grant writes this: for those who do choose cremation, the most important thing to remember is that cremains are to be treated with precisely the same respect given to the body from which they come. They are to be buried or interred in a columbarium exactly as a body would be. So what's a columbarium? A columbarium is, so most people are buried in the ground, a grave, but a columbarium is like an above ground, it's kind of like a wall with niches in it. Maybe you've seen that. So actually I had Bob Pitchford said that Fairlawn Cemetery here in town, that's the one on 51, they're actually in the process of building a columbarium. So he printed this out. I'm just going to pass this around if we just make sure it kind of goes all the way around. And so it has these little niches, and you can actually put two urns in each niche. So that's kind of an advantage. Now, when we talk about urns, we were talking earlier with a few folks. Depends on the size of the urn. Most urns are, but sometimes, I don't know, sometimes they're really tall. So you're not going to be able to put this big of an urn into a niche unless it goes sideways. I don't know. You have to work that out with the funeral home. But I'll just pass this around. So you want to make sure that ashes are treated in the same way that a coffin would be. And so there's become, let's just keep reading actually, because he'll get to this. So he says they are to be buried or interred in a columbarium exactly as a body would be. Just as one would not keep grandma's casket in the living room, neither should one keep her in an urn on the mantle. Okay? And just as no one would dismember a body in order to distribute it to the deceased's favorite places, neither should the cremains of a loved one be flung far afield. A cottage industry has arisen with creative uses for cremains, from having them shot into space, compressed into gems for jewelry, embedded into paintings, split into lockets, and even packed into bullets for hunting. But all of these belie a modern sense that the body is disposable, a mere shell, rather than a truly sacred and integral part of the whole person. The bodies of the dead, whether or not they are cremated, are sleepers awaiting the resurrection and should be laid to rest in the sleeping places, cemeteries. This is a body once washed in baptism, anointed with the oil of salvation and fed with the bread of life. This is the body whose hand clothed the poor and embraced the sorrowing. All right? So, what we want to do is we want to keep the body intact, whether in a coffin or in an urn. Does that make sense? Pretty clear? But there really is, and when you go, I know it, especially if you go to Strode, they have a little room in the back that you can tour, and they have like different coffin types. And then they have like this little display of like the things you can do with ashes. And I haven't seen the bullets for hunting, but you can do kind of jewelry, you can kind of split it up. And in the Catholic tradition, we don't do that. We don't do that. We want to keep everything together. All right? So I encourage you to read the whole article because I think it'll help you as you go. All right, so that question of casket or cremation. Again, just make your wishes known, write it down. A lot of people choose cremation, quite frankly, because it's cheaper. If you have an urn at a funeral mass, what we do is we have it kind of up on a table at the front of the church. But we do the exact same thing, right? At the beginning of a funeral, the first thing we do is we spray the casket or the urn with holy water as a reminder of the person's baptism. So whether it's a coffin or whether it's an urn, we do the exact same thing. Then we also place what we call a pall, P-A-L-L. We place a pall over the casket. We also have, though, an urn pall. It's just a lot smaller. And that is then placed on top of the urn at the front of the church. Okay? Any questions about that? Pretty clear? Yeah,
Do all Catholic churches have that urn pall?
I don't think all of them do.
I've never seen it until
Yeah.
you do it, and I know.
Yeah, I think it's cremation is becoming so common now. I can't imagine a church not having one. We have one. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just becoming, I mean, I don't know if it's maybe half of all funerals are an urn versus a coffin, but it's just becoming more and more common. Okay, so now let's talk about the things that happen at the church. It's very, very common, not required, but common to do something the night before a funeral. So oftentimes our funerals here are in the morning. They're usually at about 10 a.m. But the night before, there can be some kind of gathering. This can take on a very formal tone. It can also take a very informal tone. We typically, we always offer to have it here at the church. Some people prefer to have it, especially if it's going to be a little more informal. People may have something at their home. Back in my roots in Boston, it's called an Irish wake. And it took place in the living room of the deceased. The coffin was there, and everybody was there. There was food, there was drink, there was stories, and it lasted for hours and hours and hours, right? There would be sometimes that in the afternoon, and then we go to the church for a more formal rosary or a liturgy of the word, and then the next day is the funeral. So a lot of that is really up to you of how you want to do it. I really like something the night before for a couple reasons. One is it allows for some of the stories to be told. So really we don't, like a eulogy doesn't really have a place in the funeral mass. And I know you've seen it, but it's really discouraged in the mass itself, where we have the mass and then everybody sits down and somebody comes up and tells great stories about the deceased. The time for that really is the night before. The other advantage of doing something the night before is it just allows more people to come. As important and as wonderful as you are, there might be, the day of your funeral, somebody who you know from work, or they might have to work and can't miss. I know that sounds weird. Like, what do you mean they're not going to come to my funeral? It's me. I'm super important. They might be out of town. They might have something else going on. So the more options you give people to have, they could come the night before or to the funeral the next day, or both. So it just gives people another option. So there's a couple different options. You can do kind of a real formal liturgy of the word. So think of it as like the mass cut in half. There could be scripture readings. There could be a homily from a priest or a deacon. And then somebody can get up and kind of tell some stories. What has been sort of the custom here, but it's just sort of what happens. Typically there's a rosary. So one of the priests or a deacon leads the rosary. That lasts usually about 20-25 minutes or so. And then a couple people get up and tell stories. One thing I would encourage you to do is, if you have specific people in mind, to write that down. I would like this person to speak and this person to speak. What I've seen is, what I would discourage, I should say, is kind of an open mic situation. Okay, now anyone who wants to, it can oftentimes go well, it can also go badly. Because either it goes on forever and ever, or you probably have seen where, okay, would anyone like to say anything? And now you feel bad. What? No one has anything to say? When in fact people just might be shy. They don't have anything prepared. So I would really encourage, if you're going to do that, have a couple people who know you well, who are going to get up and speak. I would encourage them to write down what they want to say. The spontaneous speech doesn't always quite go the way you want it to. I would also encourage, your relatives better than I do, but you know who's going to get up there and say something inappropriate. So don't write them down, okay? I've been to many funerals over the years where it's kind of this person's sort of their chance to kind of either stick it to the deceased or to kind of tell stories really that aren't that aren't appropriate for any setting, much less in the church. So be aware, you know your own families. But that night before, that's the time for eulogies. That's the time for some of those stories to be told. The other time for that could be also at the reception after the funeral, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yeah.
When you have the rosary, do you bring the coffin into the rosary, and then does it go back? Is that?
Yeah. So the question was, is the body present at the rosary? And I would say 90% of the time. It doesn't have to be, but that's also a time. In many cases, again, not required, but in many cases, the body is there and the casket is open. Because what we would say is once the funeral mass begins, the coffin really should not be opened anymore. So the time for kind of a viewing, if you will, could either be at the funeral home the day before or at the rosary the night before. So many people here will do the rosary with the coffin open, but that's entirely the choice of the family. And the funeral home will ask you which you prefer. And the church has no preference. Okay, excellent. All right, so turn over on the back here. Let's talk about the funeral mass. The couple decisions that we're going to ask the family to make are kind of the day and the time. But again, you have to work with the church on that. Both for what might be going on in the life of the parish, the priest. I know it's sometimes a priest is not available, and then you gotta find another priest. And we're lucky here, of course, we have two priests, and so that makes priests sort of generally available. But it might not be I prefer this priest over that priest, and we get that. We're okay with that. It's also to think about if you have other priests in your life, who maybe former pastors, people who have been important to you. Some of you have priests in your family. They are always welcome. Typically, it would be, except in rare circumstances, it would be the pastor or the associate pastor who would be the main celebrant of the funeral. And then any other priests who come, deacons who come, would be up there on the altar. And maybe could even give the homily. But typically, the pastor or the associate pastor would be the main celebrant, with a few exceptions. We can talk that through. So the first decision is day and time. What time is it going to be? There's a lot of factors in that, especially if you have family traveling in from lots of other places. Typically, the funeral is usually within 3, 4, 5 days. But especially during COVID, we've had funerals sort of 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later. As family tries to get into town. So that's another consideration. So then we're going to ask the family if they would like to choose two things. To choose the readings for the Mass and also to choose the music for the Mass. So we have this nice little book, and I brought a bunch of them. So if you want to take one of these home, we would hand this book to the family. And in this book, it has all of the relevant scripture readings for a funeral. Now, there's more in it than you need. It's like, what opening prayer do you want? I would say we're not going to worry about that. Just pick the readings. This is also available on the internet. What I'll do let me just make a note to myself. In my flock note that I send out every Thursday, I'll include the link to the website. It's basically this book on the internet, so you can pass it around to families. But anyway, if you want to take one of these, feel free, and you can just have it forever and ever and ever, okay? And in here are the readings most relevant to a funeral. We would ask everyone to pick, you're going to pick 4 readings. You're going to pick something from the Old Testament. You're going to pick a responsorial psalm. It's basically like a Sunday Mass. You're going to pick a second reading, which usually comes from one of St. Paul's letters. And then you're going to pick a gospel, something from the Gospels. And that book will walk you through it. So that's kind of the first thing. What sometimes happens, I'll tell you though, is a lot of families will just say, Father, can you pick And we're happy to do that. We're happy to do that. Some families don't have strong feelings about it. Some families are kind of, there's too many decisions to make. You just do it. And we're happy to take that off your plate. We can do that. Then the other one is music. One thing we're putting together is kind of a list of about maybe 20 or 30 hymns that are the most commonly used at a funeral. What we want to avoid, number one, all the hymns chosen need to be church hymns. You know, people will say, can you play the theme from Les Miserables? They really loved it. Like, no. We'll say it as nicely as we can, but we're not going to do that. You can do that at the reception. You can do that in a slideshow if you make one of those later. But we're going to play church hymns. And it's pretty wide open as to what those might be. We have here the Gather hymnal that we typically use. But we can also sing other things as long as it's a church hymn and it's known. But we're going to put together a little list of kind of the 30 most popular. What ends up happening a lot of times sitting with families is I end up singing a bunch of songs. And they go, yeah, that one. Because think about how many like church hymns do you like actually know? If I said like, let's do a little survey. Is there a hymn that you know you want sung at your funeral? Go. Be not afraid, okay? So then, if you're sitting with a family, and maybe some of them are not Catholic or not practicing, they're like, what does that sound like? And then I say, be not afraid. And they go, oh, yeah, I remember that one, okay. Okay, yeah, let's do that. Okay, and then we write that down. Okay. The Ave Maria, okay, yeah, is very popular, yeah. How great thou art, yeah. The prayer of St. Francis, make me a channel of your peace. Okay, yeah. What else comes to mind? On eagle's wings, okay. And he will raise you up on eagle's wings, okay. Maybe one more.
All of them make you cry.
All of them make Nan cry. So there's some good hymns out there. There's some good hymns out there. We had one, just most recently we had the funeral for Bill Ron. It was here just a few weeks ago. And Bill's daughter got married I guess it was about 3 years ago. And there's this beautiful hymn called "O God, Beyond All Praising." We sing it from here from time to time. But it's like a hymn of like, it'll lift you up. I mean, it's a hymn of great praise to God. And it was sung at the end of his daughter's wedding. And I sat down with the family, and the first thing they said was, we want "O God Beyond All Praising" at the end of the funeral. We got it. We did it. And it was really quite beautiful and very appropriate. So anyway, so be thinking about music as well. If you like steal a Gather hymnal for like a week, we won't come and find you. But if it's more than a week, I know where you live. Okay. So be thinking about readings and music. The other thing I should add there is also then who you want to do things in the funeral. So for example, we would have the family choose lectors to do the first reading and the second reading. There, you might just be thinking about relatives, children, grandchildren. I would say we have a preference for someone who's Catholic and who's familiar with the liturgy. And so in terms of kind of timing when they go up, they'll know that. I would also just choose someone who's going to be able to do it. I'll tell you, I was in college and I was chosen to do the first reading at my grandfather's funeral, and I got about 5 words in and lost it. And I actually, was really cool, side note, totally. It was actually one of the more kind of defining moments in my vocation, because I literally started crying and I couldn't get through it. And the priest comes from all the way over, and he comes and he stands right next to me, and he read it as I'm standing there just like a total mess. All right. Now, liturgically, not ideal, right? It kind of but choose someone who's going to be able to proclaim the Word of God well. Right? We try to do that on our Sunday masses and daily masses. we want that as well for your funeral. You can also choose who brings up the gifts. A lot of times that's like the grandchildren. Even if there's a bunch of them, I mean, here we've done it where there's 15, 20 grandchildren. Not everyone's going to be carrying something. Just probably the first two are. But we've seen it sometimes where like the first two will have the bread and the wine, and all the others will have maybe a flower or something like that. So we don't want to get too sort of nichey, you know, like grandpa really liked football, so we're carrying, you know, like, we're not doing that. But anyway, so think about who to bring up the gifts, and then also like pallbearers. Typically you choose 6. And here in the Catholic funeral, the pallbearers actually have not during the Mass itself, but when we go out to the curb, the pallbearers are going to lift the casket. And then when we get to the cemetery, the pallbearers are going to carry the casket from the car to the graveside. So you got to pick some people who can lift. Okay? Yep.
If you have a cremation.
Oh, so if you're cremated, what a lot of times people will do is kind of they'll put down pallbearers, but the pallbearers really don't do anything. So somebody is going to carry the urn. A lot of times we'll actually let the funeral home do it, only because you don't want to drop it. It sounds terrible. But the funeral home is just, they know that they do it all the time. So you don't need pallbearers. Yeah. Okay, so then we get to the burial. Yep.
4 songs that you pick out.
Oh, so musically, typically 4 songs. So there'll be like an opening hymn. There'll be a song at the offertory when the bread and wine are brought up and the priest and the deacon are preparing the altar. Then there'll be a song or two during Holy Communion. And then there'll be a song at the very end. So I would say 4 or 5 songs.
And when you do the song of farewell, there are some other options.
Yeah, so at the very end of the funeral, and I really think one of the most beautiful things in the Catholic funeral rite is the body is incensed. And what we believe, number one, is anytime we use incense, it's our prayers rising up to God. It's that beautiful image. But then when we actually incense the body, it's a recognition that this body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And that the body has great dignity. It's why we don't spread ashes all around. So during the incensation, it's like kind of a song of remembrance. I'm trying to think of the words of it now. Saints of God, come to her aid. Hasten to meet her, angels of the Lord. Receive her soul and present her to God the Most High. May Christ who called you take you to himself. May angels lead you to Abraham's side. All of that put to music. So there are different versions, but each church kind of has 1 or 2 that they know. And so it varies. So like, I'm trying to think of the one here. We have a couple that we can do. But I know the one I went to a lot of funerals when I was a priest in Tulsa, and I've never heard that one here. So like lots of the Tulsa parishes will do this one, but we don't know that one here. So there's probably not going to be a choice necessarily, although we could work with you. We have very talented musicians and cantors, so we could probably adjust. Yeah, Betsy.
Out of town grandchildren or family members who are altar servers.
So the question was about altar servers. I'm kind of not always I'm not a fan of the visiting altar server. Only because they don't, I mean, we would do it. If there was a grandson who was like, it's been my life's dream to serve grandma's funeral, let's go.
Well, I think more along the lines of, it's been my life's dream to be a priest and I want to carry the cross.
So usually for servers, we have here, if we have seminarians here, they would serve the funeral mass. And then we have a little team, mostly of some of our homeschool families who are radically available in the middle of the day. The Cabine boys and Gabriel and Ella Ringwald, and so they're kind of our go-to servers. The Terrells were, but then the Terrells moved to Nebraska. They were good go-to servers as well. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about the burial. Talk about choosing a cemetery. So keeping in mind that we want you to be buried either in the ground or in a columbarium. So we want to avoid we're gonna take the ashes home. Now, and I get it, and I want to say this with all compassion. I get why people want to do that. Just the danger of it. This actually happened. This is probably 5 years ago now. It was right when Bishop Condrela came about 5 years ago. One of the funeral homes in Tulsa called the bishop's office and said, "Hey, Bishop, we have a lot of urns with ashes in them, kind of unclaimed." And there were stories behind each one of them. Some of them, they just simply didn't have family. They died. One was a homeless man who died. He was cremated, sort of on the city's dime, and just kind of put on a shelf. But one of them was the kind of the backstory was the urn was brought home by a family. The family moved and left the urn behind. So this new family moves in, they open the closet and are like, and so they gave it, anyway, so we're just trying to avoid kind of those kinds of things. So we want you to be buried. We want you to be buried. So choosing a cemetery. Here in Stillwater, we have, there's two main cemeteries. Fair Lawn, which is the one on 51 east of town, and then Sunset Memorial Garden, which is on Perkins Road, between here and Perkins. Both of them can be buried in the ground. Sunset Memorial Garden only has flat. You can't have like a above ground gravestone. It's all flat. So that may be a preference of yours. The other thing to consider perhaps is even buying more than one plot. So what we see, I don't know if you remember, just a couple weeks ago we had Bob Lambert's funeral here. So when we went to the cemetery, it's really kind of cool to bury Bob as the family is standing around. It's like a little Lambert neighborhood there. You know, wow, okay, there's Bob, and there's that, and there, oh, there's Bob's parents, and so there's kind of a cool thing if you can pull that off to kind of have everybody sort of all in one place. But there's also a cost savings if you buy, sort of more than one. But anyway, that's up to you. There's also other cemeteries, and we've done from here. We've gone to Ponca City, we've gone to Oklahoma City, we've gone to Tulsa. So we'll go wherever you want to be, wherever you want to be buried. So in that one that's going around, the Columbarium at Fairlawn, most places, most niches, you can put 2 urns in a niche. And in a burial plot too. Yeah, especially if you have an urn. Yeah, you can, like a coffin, takes up a good amount of space. So think of like how many, I don't know, you wouldn't put like 10 urns or something. I guess you could. But anyway, you can put multiple in one grave. Just 2? Okay.
Sunset will let you bury if I'm cremated, I can be buried on my husband's top of his casket.
Okay, so just to reiterate that, so her husband is deceased and was buried in a coffin, that she can be buried in an urn on top of the casket. So I don't know all those details; those can all be worked out with the funeral home. But there are some options to kind of think through. Okay. So yes, so let's get into that. So when in the rite of the church, the funeral mass ends at the cemetery. So I'll walk you through it. So the beginning of the mass is the blessing of the body, the placing of the pall. We come in, the opening prayer. We have the readings chosen by the family. We celebrate the Eucharist, the Liturgy of the Eucharist. And then after the Liturgy of the Eucharist, there's a prayer, and then the incensing of the body. But one thing to notice next time you come to a funeral, after the body is incensed, and there's a prayer that the priest says, and then either the priest or the deacon, there's not a final blessing. So notice on Sundays, there's a definitive end to the Mass. There's a final blessing, and the deacon says, get out of here, go away, all right, go in peace. At the end of a funeral, there's not. The deacon or the priest will say, let us take our sister to her place of rest. That's the end. No blessing, right? Because in the church's mind, the funeral is still going. So now we all go out, we go to our cars, we go to the cemetery. There's a few more prayers and a little bit of scripture, and then the ground is blessed. If it's not a Catholic cemetery, then we bless the ground. And then there's the final blessing from the priest to the people that brings the funeral mass to a close. So that can get it gets a little confusing sometimes because sometimes people they don't want to go all the way to the cemetery and then come back. They want to have the funeral, and then can we eat and then go to the cemetery? And I'll just say, in the church's mind, the cemetery and the funeral mass are together. And so when that's over, then we can sort of go back to your house, back here to the church. We're happy to provide a meal. Anyway, that's the idea. Yes, please.
What if you're being buried in a remote cemetery?
In a remote cemetery, locally?
No.
Like somewhere else. Okay, so this happens where you're not from here, or maybe you have a family plot. My family, a lot of them are buried up in Boston. If you are going to be buried later, we would still do what we do at the funeral mass. We would still say, let us take our sister to her place of rest, even though we know that that's not going to happen for 2 weeks. So then, since we're not going to the cemetery, we would just go about our day, or go right to a meal, or to your house, or whatever that may be. So it's kind of there's always a little bit of fudging there, because different circumstances are different. If we're going to go, we had a funeral a couple years ago where the burial was in Chickasha. So we did the funeral here, we had lunch, and then a very small group drove to Chickasha. So that can be fudged a little bit.
So if that happens, when you do actually bury her, should you contact the priest in that town?
Yeah, so if you're going to be buried somewhere else, so it happens here a couple times a year. We get a call from a family we don't know. They live somewhere else, but the burial, they want a burial here, and we're happy to do that. We'd have one of the two priests, we have 4 deacons, all of us know what we're doing, and we can help. So if you're doing that in another place, you can just call the parish there. And if you ever have trouble getting a hold of a priest somewhere else, sometimes they'll take a call from a priest that they wouldn't take. I don't know. Priests are weird. We're not always easy to get a hold of. Yeah.
You said there was another service that you didn't have a mass.
So there is a possibility. So if, for example, if the body is not available, or if the body is not present, we would not have a funeral mass per se. We would have what we call a memorial mass. So that would be there have been times when there's a need for an autopsy, or the body is lost, or something. Is that what you're referring to, or no?
No, I thought you said that you don't have to have a mass. Some people didn't want a mass.
Oh, some people didn't want a mass, but I would say that they should. So if someone is a Catholic, they ought to have a proper funeral mass. But sometimes the family is not on the same page as the deceased, and they don't want to do it, and so they just skip the church and go right to a burial, or they take the urn home, or
So you don't have a service at the church?
because the family doesn't want one. We would prefer that they did, for the deceased. But sometimes the family maybe the kids are not religious, or the kids have something against the church, or, there's all kinds of dynamics. But ideally, there should be a funeral mass. Yeah, Tom?
So in other words, we do have a right for marriage without mass included, but not for funeral.
So you could, so we could, you can do a funeral outside of mass. It would be rare. I don't know what the occasion would be to do.
I'm thinking just because some family member really strongly objects
Yeah,
to the mass.
yeah. So it's in the book. I don't think I've ever seen it.
So could you go do like that at the funeral home?
So sometimes people will, not do something at the church. They'll just have like a memorial service at the funeral home. And that's the same thing. I would say it's allowed. I mean, it's allowed, but not encouraged. Yeah, Baker.
Where are the ashes stored if for some reason you can't have a mass for illness or weather or whatever, people can't gather, say for 2 or 3 weeks?
Sure.
Where are the ashes stored?
So the question was, if the burial is going to be later, where does so in that case, sometimes people will take the ashes home and then transport them to wherever they're going. The funeral home can also do that. But if it's a casket, then the body would be stored at the funeral home and then transported to wherever it's going. The funeral home would do that at an extra cost. Keep in mind. Yeah, please.
My brother-in-law was buried before the mass.
Yep.
Okay, and then that happened, we went to the mass and had lunch after.
Yeah.
So is that practice?
Yeah, so the question was, she was saying her brother was, they did the burial, then had mass, then lunch. I've seen that. I don't get it.
Well, because of the distance,
That could be, okay.
we're talking the city, so.
Sure. Yeah, I could see that. I think in the church's liturgy, that's not ideal. To bury, then have the funeral mass. I think ideally those would be reversed. If I was asked, would you do that? I would do it under duress. No, under.
Well, I didn't know, it was weird.
Yeah.
I would not like that.
Yeah. Because I think part of it too is the church is very wise. We've had these things going for a couple thousand years. There's a certain closure. You don't get full closure ever, but there's a certain closure at the cemetery. I even recommend. I've seen some people do it. There's places where families that will actually have the casket lowered into the ground in front of everybody. That's an option. I kind of like it because it really it's final. You see it with urns, and it happens almost every time because the hole is already dug. The hole is this big and this deep. So somebody from the family takes the urn and literally gets down on their knees and puts it into the ground. And I encourage families to there's the big pile of dirt here, to everybody come and take some dirt and you don't have to do that. It's not, the church doesn't call for that. But there's those kinds of things. I think especially with children, grandchildren, it kind of gives them, they did something to help in the burial. So anyway, there's some good options there. Yeah, Mick. There's a cost to use the church. So yes and no. A funeral mass, the church charges, we charge nothing. The priest or the deacon charge nothing. Typically what happens is, what we do ask is that there be some remuneration for the organist and the cantor. And then what happens a lot of times is people will write a check to the priest or the deacon, or like a $20 bill to the altar servers. None of that is required. We don't. Where's my check? I'm not doing this funeral until I get my check. We would never do that, of course. And all of that usually is actually worked out through the funeral home. So what happens on most funerals is when the funeral home gets here, they hand me a bunch of envelopes. And I take one is one is for me, one is for the deacon, a couple for the altar servers, one for the organist, one for the cantor, and that's it. Yep. But like the meal that we offer, Mona Pratt, who's here, Mona has a great team, that's all free. A lot of times people will, kind of write a check afterwards to say thanks, but none of that is, we have a budget for it, none of that is expected. All right, these are great questions. Keep going.
When you go to the funeral, they have a line for each one of those things, and then they tell you how much the suggested cost.
Yes.
At that time.
Yep.
And they have your name on there.
Okay. I've never been through that process. Yeah. So the funeral home, the funeral home will walk you through all of that. And to which you can say yes or no. And the good thing about that is then the funeral home takes care of it. So ultimately you're going to get a bill when it's all over, and those will all be in there. So you're not sitting down the morning of a funeral and writing out a bunch of checks. Yeah, Mary.
I appreciate the fact that the ashes are all to be kept together in the urn. Is it possible for the urn to be opened and the ashes put into a hole in the ground without the urn?
I've never. So the question was, can the urn be opened and the ashes poured? I've never seen it, and I probably would discourage it in the same way. To go back to Father Grant's article, that we wouldn't do that like with a body. You wouldn't like. This sounds terrible. You wouldn't open the casket and like.
Okay, but how about, I have seen it where people put it in a box, take it, and then put it in the ground, but our church, I meant the Catholic Church.
Put the ashes into a box.
Well, they gathered the ashes, and then the family put the ashes into the hole in the ground.
Oh, I see. I guess I would discourage it. I've never seen it. I don't know that it would be prohibited.
Well, they give you a box.
They will give you a box, or you can buy.
And the ashes are in a plastic bag inside that box.
Right.
That box is supposed to be waterproof.
Right.
And that's in lieu of buying, or if you
Yep.
maybe not use that box.
No, you can. A lot of people do. It's a black box. It ends up being about this big. It's very humbling to think, oh man, my whole body fits in a box this big. It's true. But then a lot of people will have their own urn, or they'll buy an urn. OSU or something on there. Okay, let's do a couple more here. Oh yeah, please.
So when you talk about like possibly having a rent a casket.
Yes.
And then cremate it afterwards, which is gonna take a few days before you can go bury the ashes.
Right.
So how do you work with that with the priest?
So we would do the funeral mass and then nothing after. And so usually what I would do at the funeral, if you had a casket and they were going to be cremated later or buried somewhere else later, I would usually just announce that at the funeral. This person will be, the internment will take place on this day and in this place. Then people will know, like, wow, why isn't everyone going to the cemetery? Just to kind of clear up any misconceptions.
And then we get you to come to the cemetery on that.
Right,
day.
and so then it would be scheduling a time with a priest or a deacon to come to the cemetery at another time. Yep. Okay, these are good. Okay, just a couple other quick things. When the funeral is over, again, I mentioned we would offer a reception here. We've fed as many as 200 people. I mean, we can pull off something pretty good. And it's just very nice for the family to be able to just come back, kind of relax. Sometimes we'll have, we have a screen here. Sometimes we'll have a little slideshow going. A lot of times people like to bring sort of stuff from the person's life. A lot of times you'll see in our narthex, which is the area right outside the front doors here, pictures. That's usually where flowers go. Just whatever sort of stuff to remember the person. And then sometimes that kind of gets brought in here. Anyway, there's lots of options there. Some people like to do it. Some people they want to just go home. And that's totally fine too. That's totally fine too. Okay? Then I would encourage, when it's sort of all said and done, one thing you can put in your plans is to have masses celebrated for you or for your relatives. At every mass here in this church, you're going to hear some name of the person for whom this mass is being celebrated. So I encourage that, whether that's here. Sometimes here there's kind of a waiting list. If you called today and said, I want to have a mass celebrated tomorrow, well, we're kind of booked up through, Christmas or so. But there's a lot of priests around the world, religious orders, that you can call or email and have masses celebrated for yourself or for your loved one, wherever that may be. So that's another kind of good idea. Just a few other considerations, in addition to your funeral plans. If you've not yet kind of sat down with a trusted attorney, I would just encourage you to do so. Just to think through the question, where is my money going? Where is my stuff going? Who is getting it? Those are kind of hard decisions to make. But what you don't want, I think ideally, going back to my dad, he didn't want sort of the 5 kids sort of battling over who gets the car and who gets mom's ring and who, sort of all of that stuff. Now, I get along with all my siblings, but not every family gets along. And I've seen it where there becomes this sort of battle over the estate when, in fact, the deceased could have headed that off years in advance by just listing it out. This is to be sold. So think through that question. Where is my stuff going? I would encourage you within that, in kind of in a mentality of stewardship, to consider the church, the parish, the diocese, Catholic Charities, OSU, whatever it may be, that you also have a charitable mindset in that regard as you think about what you're going to do. I knew a family in Tulsa. They had 8 kids, and when they sat down to do their will, they had they gave this sort of an equal amount to all 8 kids, and then they put Bishop Kelly High School as their 9th kid. And so we got one of the kids was really mad about it, but it was okay. But anyway, so kind of having that charitable mindset in mind. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground. What other questions are on your mind while we're all here? Yeah, please, Carolyn.
My mother just sat down with all 8 of us and said, Big Brother is going to make all the decisions and I don't want any parts.
Yeah, did that work?
Yes.
All right. So Carolyn said her mother sat down with all 8 kids and said the oldest son is making all the decisions and don't fight about it. All right, that's one route to take if you trust your children to all get along. Yeah, Sandy.
We went to the lawyer. Yes, 3 times. You are the only child. Yes. The lawyer. You are the only child. Yes. You are the only child. Yes.
Yeah.
He said, this is going to be a piece of cake. So.
Yeah. It gets complicated when you have kids and grandkids and that may be, especially if some of you have, maybe your home is worth a lot, or your car, or that diamond ring that's been passed down through the family. And so really it's a gift to your next of kin to make those decisions now, put them in writing, make them official, and then nobody can fight about it because it's all set. Okay, let's maybe do 2 more questions. Tom.
It sometimes works to say, Bill's making all the decisions and don't fight it, but it's sometimes a very great gift to children to have it all down in writing, the decisions made by you, and rather than making them do it, because that can create some real problems between siblings.
Sure.
They can be angry, and I've often said, you never really know people until there's money on the table.
Oh, wow. So did you hear that? Tom said that you never really know someone till there's money on the table. Yeah. Yeah. If you can head off, a lot of that. Okay, one more, please.
Mine isn't a question, but just another resource. Scott Hahn has a wonderful book called Hope to Die.
Yeah.
And I was actually reading it the time my mother died earlier this year, and I finished it at her deathbed. But it's just a beautiful, it really brings in a lot of theology behind resurrection of the body.
Sure. Beautiful.
It's a wonderful resource.
That's good. I'll link that in my Thursday flock note that I sent out. I'll send the link to the funeral readings, and I'll put that book in there. I trust anything Scott Hahn writes. Yeah, Mike.
Just to follow up on that, with the same book, and you have to read it, but he says, yes, cremation is permitted in the church, but he says it is more fitting to be buried.
Yeah.
And reading the book, you'll understand what that really means. I was kind of ambivalent or not sure, but after reading the book, I was more prepared.
Yeah, so I think the church definitely has a preference for a coffin over an urn. But urns are permissible and common. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Woo! How about that? We did good, huh? Okay. Yeah, thanks. So, we're going to do this again tonight at 7 o'clock. You're welcome to come back, tell other people. And then I recorded all this, so we'll get it out there. Get it up on YouTube. And hope everybody has a great day. If you want to stay for Mass, Mass is at 12:10 today. And I hope everybody has a great day. Let me shut down my recordings here.